Hey guys, Grant Note from the Infinity Blade Forum here again with another video. This time this is a Stone Demon 5:1 ratio video. And I'm using all the typical gear, so I don't really need to go through that again. I covered most of that in the Saydhi video. So if you need more information on how to fight or what class setup you should probably use, you can check that video out for more information. And I'm not going to talk about that again. Probably not ever again. Okay? So you can just go ahead and enjoy the fight. Since the Stone Demon, in my honest opinion, is relatively easy in terms of step backs and just general fighting style and moves, there's not really many tips I can give as far as fighting him goes. It's not the kind of thing where I'd have to deeply analyze all the step backs and tell you how to work on them. Probably unnecessary with Saydhi too. It's just one of those things that you pick up right off the bat. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Give it a run through a couple times, and I'm sure you'll be able to nab it. Okay? So that being said, I'm going to just talk about something completely irrelevant to the 5-1 that's going on in the background. And that is just sort of a comparison between Infinity Blade 1 and Infinity Blade 2. Okay, so I'm going to cover a couple different aspects of each game, and that just includes, things that are like fighting style, the overall feel of the game, which could include the music and the setting and the surroundings, etc. And I'm just going to overall just kind of cover a comparison between the two games. So first, why don't I begin with, like I said, the fighting style. Obviously in Infinity Blade 1, it is completely sword and shield, or, if you prefer, finger and shield. You can't really get out of that in Infinity Blade 1. And in Infinity Blade 2, we already know that we can do sword and shield, we can do heavy weapons, which would be mostly two-handed, and we can also do dual wielding, which is two different weapons, one in each hand. Okay, so the fighting style is very different and it has a different feel. So if you play Infinity Blade 1 and you use the light class, which is the only class, and then you go to Infinity Blade 2 and use the light class, like I said, in Infinity Blade 2, you can feel the major difference between the two. In Infinity Blade 1, it is clearly harder to parry, that's one thing, and of course the dodges are unlimited, so that's a big style difference. And another thing you may or may not notice is that in Infinity Blade 1, there is less of a pause during all of your slashing and combos. A lot less so than there are in Infinity Blade 2. So all of these stylistic differences make Infinity Blade 1, more or less, a little bit more fast-paced in terms of the light weapons. So you don't really mind using them as much in Infinity Blade 1. You don't mind being trapped in that class. It's still enjoyable to go ahead, even if you're a constant dual wielder, to go ahead and pick up Infinity Blade 1 and start playing it again. There's just no problem there, quite simple and still quite fun. Now, if you go to the light class in Infinity Blade 2 and try to pick it up, it's a lot slower, and you'll find that the Titans are a lot harder to defeat with that light class without putting a lot of health power in. So that's kind of one of the major problems with Infinity Blade 2 in terms of the light class and other classes besides dual wielding, is just the major difference in how the fighting styles feel, the pauses in between each hit. Those all have stylistic characteristics that sort of define each game. So, moving on from fighting style, which is pretty obvious in the games, is just the overall feel of the game. So there's a different type of music, for sure. And, a lot of people may think that music is rather insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but really, music is extremely important in defining how a game feels, what sort of tone it takes on. In Infinity Blade 1, you'll notice that the tone is very mysterious, especially when you first start off and you just have those really rambunctious, chaotic noises when you first enter the throne room of the God King. All of those things help create this dramatic, mysterious atmosphere, and your mind immediately says, where am I? Who am I? Who is this God, this entity sitting on the throne? You ask all these questions, and the music really helps deliver these questions to your mind. However, in Infinity Blade 2, there are different music styles rather, that are adapted depending on what style of enemy you're fighting. So, for example, if you're fighting a heavy weapon class enemy, it's most likely going to start off with sort of the more I don't know how to describe it, a little bit heavier of music, if that makes sense. You can kind of test it out and see what I mean there, but you'll see what I mean. So depending upon your enemy, you're going to get different styles of music, and that doesn't really, the music in Infinity Blade 2 doesn't really allow for any sort of stylistic tone for the game as a whole. It's more just enjoyable in a fight, if that makes sense. So that's the big difference between the music in the both games, is that in the first game, it's more to develop a tone throughout the entirety of the game. But in the second game, it's more just for fun. It doesn't develop any sort of style, or it doesn't serve any purpose in the game as a whole, taken all together as a whole. And all in all, and I do like Infinity Blade 2 better just because of uh, the amount of different options that we have in terms of how we're setting up our classes, the amount of different enemies, etc., etc. But the tone in Infinity Blade 1 is much better, much more mysterious, and I do like that a lot better, and a huge contribution comes as a result of the music. And the next thing would be the story. The story is a lot more open in the second game, and it's a lot more open-ended in the second game, because it creates a lot of avenues for different storyline ideas, which is great. Great, great. Because they expounded on the story from Infinity Blade 1. Now, the story in Infinity Blade 2, because it's so open-ended, it does close off a lot of the mysteries while opening up many more. But the thing about those mysteries is they're not quite as enthralling as they were in the first game. Because in the second game, by then we know that you are technically a god too, that the God King and all the gods who profess to be gods aren't actually gods. It just removes a lot of mystery from the game. So even though the story is more open in Infinity Blade 2, it's a lot less interesting. So that's just kind of one of the major differences. So, the fight's sort of coming to a close here. All in all, the comparisons between the two, the fighting style, I sort of mentioned the music, the story in brief, you can tell that if you pick up and play Infinity Blade 1, it has a lot more of a mysterious feel, something that makes you want to sort of investigate. You can become enthralled with the characters, especially with the God King. You just don't know much about the world at that point, and that creates a really nice dramatic feel. Whereas, of course, in the second game, it's more for gameplay, which can be appreciated by someone who, of course, wants to play the game. So, that is the summary of the difference between the two games, and I hope you enjoyed, and I suppose I will catch you later. Have a nice evening.